Hello everyone. So I imagine that if you're a viewer of this channel, you're probably intimately familiar with the practice of counter-economics. If not, then counter-economics is the use of market exchanges outside of the state's influence to create political change, and this occurs due to this development creating an infrastructure more efficient, profitable, and cheaper to utilize than what the state provides, which will result in the state being deprived of revenue as fewer people associate with it, leading necessarily to the influence the state will be able to have over society declining, with the inevitable conclusion being a complete inability for the state to fund itself and the abolition of the government and creation of a stateless society. Transactions become more difficult to monitor as this market begins to develop around the state because people are coming to enjoy the benefits of the products and services created and provided through the countermarket agoras. People will also become more disenfranchised by the state necessarily, since the state is an objective hindrance to their quality of life. And the world as we know it has a constantly expanding counter-economy, with new innovations being created on a regular basis at this point, such as cryptocurrencies or advances in 3D printing coming into the market and making it easier to trade on a peer-to-peer basis. We're already beginning to see the early stages of this process occurring. For example, there are more daily transactions taking place with Bitcoin than through MasterCard, and despite cryptocurrency being outlawed in both China and Russia, China has hundreds of billions of dollars traded in crypto on a daily basis, and Russia has entire cities that only trade in various cryptos. This is something which is more or less guaranteed to happen, since by default all innovations lead to products becoming more efficient and easier to handle, since what leads to new products overtaking the market is to have a broader utility which applies to more consumers. Accessibility, along with ease of use and all the characteristics which exemplify these traits, are therefore going to become more prominent since they're desired. Eventually, the state's only purpose here will to be as a hindrance to the people who could otherwise do everything the state does on their own and get the services they provide at a better quality from private traders in their communities. On top of that, you have the fact that the state by design is unsustainable and will inevitably always collapse, creating boom-bust cycles while it attempts to manipulate the society's credit to sustain itself. And you get a mixture of the population as a result seeking decentralized alternatives to the state-regulated markets, both out of material and political self-interest, but people will also seek this out as to simply sustain a stable living for themselves in periods of economic depression or full collapse. The innovation which can allow this to occur has only come into existence recently. However, historically, you can see that in times of economic crisis, people trade under the table with non-fiat means of exchange to get by. A good example being the Great Depression, where so many people traded with gold that the dollar's value actually started to decline even further than it already had, and as a result, the government had to confiscate all of the privately owned gold which they had documented. Well, now you have a medium of exchange which can't be regulated by the state because it can't be monitored, and production is becoming more accessible to more people, so there are no captains of industry the state can use to bully people through anymore, since many people now have the ability to manufacture products out of their house, formerly requiring more startup capital than most people could obtain in their lifetimes on just a shoestring budget. But what causes the state to be hurt the most by counter-economics is that it deprives them of revenue. So a counter-economy is the way in which this can broadly change society. However, the principle at the end of the day is that you should seek to deprive the state of as much resources as you possibly can, because every cent you deprive the state of is a cent less that the state can use to fund itself, meaning that's a cent less that can be used on bombs, military, police, and the various welfare programs and agencies used to monopolize industry through regulations. And what's the best way to do this in the short term? Yep, Tax loopholes. Now, despite how the media attempts to portray them as being something only rich people can get, the fact of the matter is that tax loopholes exist for every piece of taxable property and every income bracket. There are literally tens of thousands of individual tax loopholes, and regardless of where you are financially, it's likely that a large chunk of them apply to you. So we'll be going over some tax loopholes that you can utilize. Now, this first one isn't really a tax loophole, as you aren't getting around paying a tax by manipulating the legal status under which you own your property. However, if you don't sign a 1040 income tax form, you're not legally required to pay income tax, though it may be difficult to find a source of income which doesn't require the signing of a 1040 form, given that the state has monopolized the market so heavily to where most people can only be wage laborers, and the only jobs available force employers to sign them due to connections with the state. It's worth it in the end, and therefore as a counter-economist, it's optimal to seek means of self-employment as a top priority. However, it's possible you may get lucky and find a small local company which won't require you to sign a 1040 in order to be employed. Just make sure to ask whether or not it's optional for employment at the said business. The capital gains tax rate overall is lower than the tax rate for wages or owning a business. So if you live in an area where you can't avoid the income tax altogether, it may be wise to start utilizing the stock market and currency trading so that you can at least pay less than you would otherwise. However, this also opens some new doors because there are far more loopholes in capital gains than there are income tax. If you own your house, you can itemize your home mortgage interest and pay in property tax, since this will lower the percentage of the amount that's financed. However, unless you happen to own a multi-million-dollar mansion, 2018-2019 US dollar market value, you're unlikely to shave off more than a couple $100 using this one. Still a few $100 less that the state has to spend on coercion, though, so in my opinion, it's worth it. If you set up a savings account in a college fund, your savings won't be taxable. Employer-paid health benefits are not taxable income to the recipient, meaning that you can receive healthcare tax-free if your employment plan covers health insurance. If you and a fellow counter-economist agree to exchange the gains and losses of certain assets without actually exchanging ownership of them, you both can get deductions on what the state would normally take from your gains. For example, if person A swaps $5 million at a floating interest rate of 0.03% in their stock against $5 million from person B on their stock, person A will pay person B a floating interest rate of 0.03% on the $5 million notional amount held by person B, and would receive from person B any percentage of increase in the stock equity index applied to the 5 million notional. This is what's commonly referred to as an equity swap, and you can not only get cuts to your capital gains tax, but also you can use this to reduce your borrowing costs in general. If you borrow a bunch of shares from an investment bank and use the shares as collateral after purchasing options have been settled, you can completely avoid the capital gains tax on any sales you make. The reason that this works is you don't actually have the money at hand from your sales. According to the state, you wouldn't have any money to be taxed for capital gains as a result. Now, even if you aren't a counter-economist, the idea of an estate tax should absolutely disgust any reasonable person. Someone you love dies, wants to give all their property to their loved ones, and then the state comes along and steals it. They just gotta have their piece. Well, here's how you can stop the state from doing this. Invest all the money owned by the dead individual into a grantor retained annuity trust, which will invest the money for you. Any income earned over and above the interest is completely free of income and estate taxes. As a result, since both the estate and income taxes only focus on property written in your name. If you're single and make less than $31,000 a year, or if you file as the head of household and make less than $46,000 a year, you can receive tax credits for putting your savings into a retirement account by claiming the saver's tax credit, which scales from 10% all the way up to 50% of what would have been taxed from your income. So, as noted earlier, there are tens of thousands of tax loopholes, but the reason I'm covering so few of them here now is for a point some of my more observant viewers may have already noticed or known prior, which is that the tax codes, not just in the US, but under any other jurisdiction, are written with the assumption that the property being taxed is legally in the individual's possession or in a taxable status. So in essence, all tax loopholes are essentially the exact same thing. Just for some perspective, there are at least a good 500 or 600 of them, which are literally the exact same thing, just for different commodities and varying amounts of resources, which is that money or any other property spent and registered as a business expense or obtained through a corporate bank account are exempt from individual taxation. So, I just went over a few of them to give you a general idea of how to utilize loopholes, since the same rule applies with all property. No joke, I realized that after writing an entire script, which was at least 50,000 words. You have no idea how annoying that was. As for tax credits, these are just individual laws, all of which are listed out on the IRS's website under credits and deductions for individuals. So these are the first two agorist strategies for liberation. 1. Trade around the state as much as possible and don't get caught. 2. Seek out as many tax loopholes and apply for as many tax credits as you possibly can. And because I'm too fucking lazy to introduce the other 3 naturally, we're going to just jump in right here and now. 3. Make the government spend as much as you possibly can. The most obvious way of doing this is to apply for every welfare benefit available to you. Even if you don't apply for welfare, you can sign up for community programs created by the state or schedule appointments through job services and drag it out as long as you possibly can. Make sure you also force them to spend as much as they possibly can. For example, take anything which they hand out and as much of it as you possibly can. However, be wary, as this will require you to associate with the state more, so do this at your own risk. Number 4. Study the state. If you don't understand the interests of the state and the tactics used by politicians, you will have a harder time contemplating the actions of rulers and government employees, making it much harder to trade around them. And finally, number 5. Challenge statists as much as possible. The state is nearly as fervent about making sure as many people vote as possible as it is manipulating markets to artificially stimulate its fiat currency. And like market manipulation, it does this for a very simple reason, which is connected to the interests of the political elite. If a large amount of the population votes or is engaged with the political system, it helps the state construct a series of illusions that people can actually control the state and that the state is just a representation of their interests. And if the population thinks that they can somehow control the politicians and that politicians are simply acting in their interests, they'll be less likely to do anything about any of the numerous and varying systemic problems caused by politicians using the state, because they'll think that all they need to do in order to change it is just vote whenever the next election is. Now, aside from how many times the idea of a representative government has been debunked on this channel alone, how it's so simple to refute this idea that you can actually do this just using a graph, and how the state's problems are a result of structural issues which exist as a result of what the state seeks to do inherently, the reason this is so important to discuss the nature of the state serves 2 key purposes to the end goals of agorism. Firstly, of course, it leads to more people becoming disenfranchised and questioning the nature of the state. This is made unquestionably clear when simply looking at the trends of anarchism in relation to the last election. When voter turnout is down, funnily enough, the state tends to contribute heavily to its own demise, as we've seen with recent elections, making both sides of the political system present themselves as being completely insane and have them act as outlandishly likely as possible to scare people into voting by making them attack each other and present themselves both as a voice of reason, but playing to separate interests in order to create the impression that one of them is a reasonable position. Both of them, of course, will always conclude that you need to vote and get back into the political system, and the state's influence will just expand until the next election, where the process will repeat and they'll pretend like they didn't just do literally the exact same thing only 4 to 8 years before. However, the problem is that this strategy of exaggerating the two evils in order to try and increase voter turnout, as they've done in the last election, is that it doesn't convince people who already know nothing is going to change that it will. It instead only leads to more people becoming disenfranchised, since it exemplifies the fact that nothing is going to change, since both candidates are already unpopular and most people don't think that they play to their interests, and leads to them questioning the political system, since they actually have to think about the nature of it, because neither position presented is actually desirable to their own interests. Secondly, it leads to more people realizing that the state is illegitimate, and more people as a result end up trading in the counter economy, which in turn makes peer-to-peer associations more profitable, leading to more investments being put into open source development projects and innovations being created which further decentralize the market, both depriving the state of revenue and making corporatism unprofitable, so the quality of our product will improve as well as prices becoming more competitive, and more people being able to become counter-economists. This will also help quite a bit, as counter-economics will inevitably become a political act as the state comes closer to collapsing, and the market begins to become unprofitable for corporatist entities. So naturally, the media and politicians will more than likely attempt to portray counter-economists as criminals and compare them with terrorists, any other of the slew of demonizing tactics they've used over the decades to scare people into a certain agenda and back into the political system. It's desirable that more people, just for this reason, are in the very least familiar with what counter-economists advocate for, so that the state's propaganda has less of an impact. In conclusion, remember the tax-exempt forms of transactions, tax credits, to deprive the state of as much revenue as possible, and to follow these 5 steps in no particular order, and congratulations! You know everything you need to in order to terrify the shit out of any politician by working towards the abolition of the state.
Who would have guessed that a guy who self-identifies as a crypto anarchist would be such a prick?